You're also there. Good to see you guys. I'm in a strange environment. I haven't done it here before. I don't know how long the sun's still going to be up. According to my watch, it's another 50 minutes, but it may get darker before then, and then I might need to just kind of pick everything up and go where there's a bit more light. So we'll see how that goes out. Hi guys. I just missed that comment over there. So I've got my laptop on over here, and so I'm not really going to be being able to see your comments the way I normally would. I will be looking out for them on my phone, but I'll try and be as interactive as I can. Lisbeth, hi. Janae Ann, hey from South Carolina, hi. Stephanie, thanks a lot for moderating and for being here. I know you've actually gotten quite caught up in it all. You've read the NEVEREST trilogy. You've read, I think, The Climb. Have you read the book on K2? Do you guys know there's also a K2 disaster in 2008? Nicole says, just listening in and cooking. Okay, well, what are you cooking, Nicole? And Stephanie's also read, there's so many books. She's read, I think, Into Thin Air, and just the sheer amount of reading material associated with the Everest disaster is staggering. Although most people tend to think about the Mountain Madness team and the Adventure Consultant Squad, the latter that was the leader of that was Rob Hall from New Zealand. There were actually quite a few other teams. There was a South African contingent, there was the IMAX team, there was a Taiwanese team, and quite a lot of other teams as well. But the people who were at the center of this, of course, were the two big teams. And, way back 25 years ago, people were paying $60,000 to, for a shot at climbing Everest. That's quite a lot of money 25 years ago. I mean, it's quite a lot of money now, but it's certainly quite a lot of money 25 years ago. The reason I'm wearing this cap is just because of the lighting. I think if I take it off, you might not actually be able to see me. So can you see when I do that, how the light changes behind me? So I sort of just need for you to see my face. That's why I've got the cap on. So what's behind me, and maybe you can get a better view that way, is the Swartberg. Maybe that's actually a better angle for now. That's the Swartberg. It means, I think I can maybe take my cap off from this side. It means black mountains. At the moment they look kind of gray, but I think generally they're kind of a blue color. But there's another area in South Africa where a mountain is called Blouberg, and that's Table Mountain from a distance. So I guess that name was taken. But it's a pretty area, isn't it? I'm staying at a place called Fynbos Ridge. It's a 5-star place, totally ensconced in the vegetation here. It's a bit of a different feel to Plettenberg Bay. It's not beaches, it's nature. And it's very peaceful here. On my way in, I drove past a vervet monkey that was, I think, sitting on a bird bath. There are big pot-bellied pigs running around. Beautiful malachite sunbirds that pop out of the vegetation all over the place. And it's just if you want to unwind, if you want to relax, if you want to write, if you want to read, it's a really good place to come to. So what we're talking about today is the Everest disaster. And I think what got me very sort of excited was, I think I was interested in it anyway, as someone who's interested in climbing. But what got me quite excited was I wrote one of my very first acts of journalism I wrote a magazine article for a newish magazine called Heartland, and it was one of my very first acts of journalism. And then I think I later published that article either on a blog or on Facebook or something. And the author, Weston DeVault, the author of The Climb, he actually happened to read it. And about Anatoly, I wandered across your blog and your description of the Krakauer Beaucreef controversy. It is the clearest exposition of the debate that I've ever seen. Thanks for remembering a consummate climber and one of the finest. That was something written by Weston DeVault, and I then went on and wrote a book about it, expanding on what I wrote in the article, and then I wrote 2 more books about it. They weren't trying to make heroes of anyone. It was really just trying to find out what happened. And some people didn't like that. Some people wanted that's the sort of inevitable hero worship you get associated with climbing mountains. And obviously in a situation like the Everest disaster, a lot went wrong. People made bad decisions. But what really happened? Was it the weather or human error? So we're going to find out about that. So we are now 25 years after the Mount Everest disaster. Even now, few know what really happened. How did 9 climbers from 4 expeditions die in a single day on Mount Everest? Why were there so many people choking up the only path up the mountain? And were the leaders, Fisher and Hall, pressured by the presence of journalists climbing on opposing teams? Were they locked in a deadly rivalry, or did they just run out of oxygen and time? Was it the weather or human error? So we're going to go through the people that were involved, the situation. In 1996, Ed Vestiers, who was up there, a very strong climber, a very reputable climber, he's also written books about it. I think he also has made documentaries along with David Brashears. But at that time, he said, a lot of people are up here who shouldn't be, right? Meaning up here on the mountain. And what he's saying there, he wasn't saying there are too many people on Everest. He wasn't saying it was overcrowded. He was saying there are people on this mountain that shouldn't be on this mountain, right? Annie Thomas, imagine spending all that money just to die. Yes, I think when you've spent $60,000, when you've paid that amount of money, and you're on the mountain and you're not, things aren't going well, and there's good reason to turn back. I think there's something that is attached to that investment that says, well, you can't just turn around willy-nilly. Now, what I can tell you guys in an ironic sense is I've spent around about $1,000, a little bit more than that, but I've spent $1,000 to go mountain bike riding with a group. And I've also started feeling, I'm not sure if I'm prepared. I'm not sure if I want to do it even. I'm not sure if I should do it. But because I've already spent the money, I'm kind of forced to do it in a way. I want to do it, but there's also a kind of a sense of, well, I'm locked in. I owe it to myself. I have to do it, kind of thing. And so there's that, except, on a much bigger scale. This mountain bike thing I'm going on is not that far away from where I am, whereas traveling to the Himalayas is a big logistical thing, and getting to the mountain is a big thing, and then getting somewhere up the mountain only to be asked, well, should I turn round, is another thing as well. Drew says getting to the top is optional, getting down is mandatory. So that's a quote from Ed Vestiers. So things have changed a lot since 1996. There are a lot more people going up the mountain, but 96 was unique just for the death toll. At that time, it was the deadliest month in the mountain's history. And interestingly, by the end of May, the toll stood at 12. Ironically, the 13th casualty was actually the mountain's first victim. So there was a Sherpa that fell ill with high altitude pulmonary edema, and he began coughing blood and sputum on April 22nd. So he was actually the first casualty of that season. And after April 22nd, which is 3 days after today, 25 years ago, he lapsed into a 2-month coma. So that's what can happen. You can get edema and suffer and suffer and suffer. And he finally died, becoming the last to die from that season, but he only died in June, right? So after the Everest disaster, media frenzy ensued. Newspapers around the world, including the Sunday Times in South Africa, put the story on their front page. 5 weeks after the fact, a 17,000-word article that proved not 100% accurate appeared in Outside magazine, written by a journalist and client on the Adventure Consultants guided expedition. And then a socialite journalist or socialite/journalist from Mountain Madness wrote a self-aggrandizing article in Time, meaning an article that was basically making, I guess, her into the hero, right? But something was wrong. More books appeared after that, some seeming to be self-indulgent and attention-seeking. And then finally in 1997, so after this media frenzy, about a year later, The Climb was published. So it's quite incredible how quickly Into Thin Air came out. It shows you how quickly a book can be written. And it was very, very well written, and still today is probably the most popular version of the events, right? But The Climb was totally different to Into Thin Air. It was not embroidered, not overstated. It did not attempt to lay blame. It soon emerged in bitter clarity that the nightmare was not the mountain. So when another book came out, it turned out the nightmare wasn't the mountain. The nightmare wasn't really the weather. The nightmare was leaders and clientele, people who were very competitive and had paid a cash price for the opportunity to gain glory, but who were reluctant to pay the price of physical preparedness. And we come back to what Ed Vesture said about some people are on this mountain that shouldn't be. And that is a very nice way of saying, you know, you aren't the kind of right person to be climbing Mount Everest. You perhaps have the wrong attitude, perhaps you got the wrong level of fitness, perhaps you have the wrong amount of experience, perhaps you're here for the wrong reasons, or a combination of those. So the mountain then stood unmoved as the various characters wished themselves up the mountain. So you did have some people who seemed to think if you paid a certain amount of money or you somehow got on an expedition, you were now entitled to get to the top. Someone is going to get you up, almost like putting you in an elevator or on a conveyor belt, right? Or on a roller coaster. So you could sort of just fold your arms and you were going to kind of be short rope to the top, or, you know what I mean, kind of taken on an express elevator up. And of course, that's not how it works, but that is kind of what happened to a couple of the climbers, that they did need to be babysat virtually all the way to the top. And did that have consequences? Yes, it did. So it was left in the end to an incredibly strong, unassuming and inarticulate, but hard as nails Russian climber, Anatoly Beaucreef, to save the weak and irrational. So you've got strong climbers, you've got weak climbers, you've got climbing leaders who died, you've got journalists, one that's very strong, one that wasn't. And who's going to save the people who are getting into trouble? Bear in mind, the leaders are trying to outperform one another, and they end up losing their lives. Who's going to save the the clients with the leaders out of the picture. And it ended up being this unassuming, inarticulate, strong, but hard as nails Russian climber Anatoly Beaucreef. And obviously when they get back from the mountain, is anyone going to give Anatoly credit for what he did? Is Anatoly going to be able to tell people what happened? Is Anatoly going to be able to explain some embarrassing situations? And the fact that he can't speak very well, I think people took advantage of, thinking we can control the narrative, we can tell the story, we can embellish, right? So ultimately, I do think he emerged as a hero that day on the mountain, not to some people, but not through the words or thanks of the people he saved. And isn't that ironic that the guy who did so much, the people that he actually saved didn't really thank him publicly? You sort of heard that it was Anatoly through all these other sources, right? Not the actual people whose life he saved. And interestingly, I was watching the documentary made by David Brashears, and I think it was made on the 10-year anniversary or something. And Anatoly is sort of mentioned fleetingly. He sort of mentioned, oh, he did something and then that was it. He's sort of very understated, and you kind of get the sense that the maker of that documentary kind of blamed Anatoly as well. Not blamed him necessarily, but maybe thought, you know what, he should have been using oxygen or something. But it just seems strange that he got such a short little, very little was mentioned of what he did. If you've seen that documentary, I think, Stephanie, you have seen it, hey? I don't know if you noticed that, Stephanie. Did you notice that not much was said about him? And if you bear in mind that the mountaineer and writer Galen Rowell describes Beaucreef's efforts as one of the most amazing rescues in mountaineering history, when you make a documentary, why wouldn't you spend a bit of time showing that, depicting that? You know, if it's one of the most amazing rescues in the history of mountaineering, wouldn't you spend a bit of time showing that? So why didn't they? So when we go back to the mountain in 1996, we ought to start with the man who knew best that day and most days how hard the mountain can be. So, you know, I think one's got to see what happened through Beaucreef's eyes and through his experience, right? So I'm just going to quote from Harold Brodkey, I think from a book called Manipulations. He wrote, I admire the authority of being on one's knees in front of the event. And I think that's a good description of Everest in a way. So in the spring of 1996, the circus at Mount Everest was fast becoming unraveled. So it was a circus before they got to the top. You know, there's actually a video, you can watch it on YouTube, where you see the teams meeting together from the different expeditions. It's also dramatized in the movie about Everest, about the Everest disaster. And the teams kind of meet up and they say, you know what, guys, if we don't arrange amongst ourselves, there's going to be a problem. You know, there's a lot of people. We need to organize how we're going to do this. We need to have a strategy. And I seem to remember the South Africans being depicted in that film as being kind of trying to say a word that YouTube's not going to be upset with, but basically it starts with A and it ends with whole. The South African team were, I think, quite arrogant. I remember following the South Africans because South Africa was watching them. It was 1996, and I think Mandela was president, and they were sort of, you know, hoping for the first South African to summit. So there was that happening as well. And then there was a lot of drama from the South Africans, and some of it was pretty embarrassing. And some of the people that were there were pretty, well, I think you guys can see for yourself in the books that have been written about it. I don't think that some of the South Africans endeared themselves to some of the fellow climbers. In any event, this meeting was meant to bring about cooperation and a strategy, and you kind of got a feeling below the summit, before they'd even climbed the mountain, that there was disharmony, that people were in it for themselves, and that proved to be kind of prescient. I mean, it did bear itself out in that way. And you might say, well, the South Africans were idiots or something, but the Mountain Madness and adventure consultants, the leaders, seem to give in to that same summit fever. What I mean is, at the bottom of the mountain, they may have meant well, but somehow the moment seemed to take over for a lot of people. So, I've mentioned Mountain Madness, I've mentioned Adventure Consultants, I've mentioned the Taiwanese team, I've mentioned that there were South Africans there, but there were at least 16 expeditions. 16, that's a lot. Participating, and as I say, among them were the Johannesburg Sunday Times expedition, Adventure Consultants, the McGillivray Freeman IMAX iWorks expedition, and Mountain Madness. So the ones I've mentioned there are sort of the main ones that were part of the events of that day. Over 100 people and a star that didn't belong, someone mentioned that, were running around the colossal flanks of the mountain. Imagine 100 astronauts on the moon, and you have an idea how festive but bizarre it was at base camp. Of course, it's only gotten worse since then. Now it's like an ongoing queue. Now it's even crazier. And I predict we're gonna see Everest-like disasters again, like the 96 disaster, but worse, because I think you've got to factor in climate change and climate-related anomalies that haven't happened yet. So I think that is waiting for the bumper amount of people going up Everest. On the other hand, technology has improved, communications improved, weather tracking data has improved as well. So that is on the side of climbers at least. So let's just quickly go through the kind of the roll call of Mountain Madness. So it was Scott Fisher, the leader from the USA. Anatoly Beaucreef was on the Mountain Madness expedition. It's important to remember this, that the head guide, the Russian head guide, he was part of the Mountain Madness expedition. So it's Scott Fisher, Anatoly Beaucreef, Neil Beidelman, also a guide from the USA, Leen Gammelgaard, a client from Denmark, Sandy Hill Pittman, she was a client and journalist from the USA, Charlotte Fox, client from the USA, Tim Madsen, client from the USA, Martin Adams, client from the USA, Pete Schunning, client from the USA, Clev Schunning, client from the USA, and Dr. Dale Cruz, also a client from the USA. So in terms of Mountain Madness, you had everyone from the USA except Leen Gammelgaard and Anatoly Beaucreef. So it was quite it was an American team. So in that sense, there was a sense of kind of solidarity and people knowing one another, if I can put it that way. And we're going to see that ended up being quite important, people speaking the same language. And of course, one of the most important people who didn't was Beaucreef, right? So now we go, and then there's also Dr. Ingrid Hunt, the team doctor and the base camp manager, right? And so, as I say, Beaucreef belonged to the Mountain Madness expedition. He was the head guide, and in his care were 7 American clients, a 34-year-old Danish woman, and 11 Sherpas. And I think what Leen Gammelgaard often said was that in the mountains, speed is safety. I think she said that a few times in the IMAX documentary, speed is safety. And I think it was Beaucreef who told her that, who said those words. It's an ironic thing to say because of the snail's pace one is maintaining on Everest. So, this idea of speed is safety. Meanwhile, you're going really, really, really slowly. So, in a way, it's a hypothetical or it's a theoretical standard. I mean, So Stephanie says you'll get to know these people more than just their names as we go along. Stephanie says you're right. Speed is not really possible. So there were 11 Sherpas. So Beaucreef had 7 American clients, and then the 8th client, a Danish woman, and she got along really well with him. And then there were 11 Sherpas, right? So there's more than one Sherpa sort of assisting per client. Lopsang Jangbu was their climbing siddar from Nepal, and he was only 23. And this would be another thing that would be highlighted is the youthfulness, possibly him being too young. And this was what worried Beaucreef. It worried him, the head guide, that I think the leader, the climbing siddar, was only 23. Gamelgard, the Danish woman, and Beaucreef developed a strong friendship. She had a lot of respect for him because she had heard about Beaucreef from Michael Jorgensen, and they had other things in common. Neither were from the USA or particularly wealthy. Leen Gamelgard would try, under his charge, to become the first Danish woman to make the summit of Everest. So there's the beginning of where you're starting to get a sense of it's not just people climbing a mountain. There's someone who wants to be the first Danish woman to the top. And we're going to go through more things like that. On another expedition, it would be the first, I think the second Japanese woman to finish the 7 summits. And so you have all of these personal milestones that are happening on the mountain, plus you have journalists that are recording everything and are going to be singing your praises or recording your blunders, kind of thing, right? So Gamelgard and Sandy Hill Pittman, a multimillionaireess and socialite, initially got on well, but soon became competitive and were constantly butting heads. So just on the one team, you had this woman from Denmark who was fairly, kind of a middle-class lady. And then you had Sandy Hill, who was a little bit different, from a different, strata of society. And so you have these 2 women already not getting along on the one team, and that's just the one team, right? Pittman, the onboard journalist, was also not the first choice for the team, and I think a lot of people forget about that Sandy Hill wasn't the first choice for Mountain Madness. The head of Mountain Madness, Scott Fisher, had first attempted to sign up John Krakauer. So this adds just another layer of intrigue to the whole thing, is that the journalist so Scott Fisher sort of started the whole thing. Scott Fisher thought, wow, it might be a good idea to take a journalist along and show the world what we're doing, and we can get a bit of exposure out of this. And then another team thought, what about us? We also need to do that, or something like that, right? And so now it becomes fraught. Now it becomes like a competition, journalist, right? And so how it happened was Scott Fisher tried to sign up John Krakauer, who was working for Outside Magazine. And what he wanted was to generate international publicity for his company. At the 11th hour, right, at the last minute, outside went to a rival expedition led by Rob Hall, asking them to beat Fisher's price. So you already have a situation here where there's like a money game going on. We'll do this for this expedition, and then it's kind of you could say it's a betrayal. You could say it's just capitalism. At the last minute, they go to a rival and they say, "Can you pay us better than than that one?" And then they say they will, right? And as a result of that, instead of having one journalist, you had two, because they did beat Fisher's price by a few $100, and that part alone, Rob Hall's expedition, Rob Hall's squad, Rob Hall's company, paying a few $100 so that John Krakauer would move over to his team, that alone may have actually cost lives, just that. If Sandy Hill Pittman hadn't been part of the whole thing, that could also have saved lives. It's interesting to speculate now. Probably interesting to see what climbers who were there would say about it. So Fisher was very upset by this. So you have Fisher going to Everest already stung by something that was his idea that was then taken out of his hands. And you could say that he was humiliated, but you've also got to wonder, when he's on the mountain and he walks by John Krakauer, what do they say to one another? What don't they say to one another? What feeling is there? And how much are those feelings detracting from the focus that needs to be on clients and on climbing, right? So you have that layer of kind of psychology that is playing out, right? Annie Thomas, are you on Patreon? Yeah, that's right. My book Neverest is going to be the next audiobook, so that's good news. So Fisher was very upset about this, but then he signed on Sandy Hill Pittman, and he felt that getting her to the summit was going to be the means to the same end. So he's lost John Krakauer, and then he ends up getting another journalist. And on paper they were both really good journalists. On paper they were both pretty big hitters in journalism, right? The real question though was, on the mountain, what were they going to be like? And Sandy Hill Pittman, according to one of Fisher's confidants, turned out to be, quote, a big piece of work. I don't know what that means. I don't know whether it means that she was high maintenance. I don't know if it means that a lot of work needed to go around her to help her get up the mountain or help her get down the mountain. But whether you disagree with that or not, Sandy Hill Pittman did seem to use up a certain amount of resources during this particular thing, which you're going to get to. And if you just compare Sandy Hill Pittman to John Krakauer, the one goes up and down in record time. In fact, John Krakauer is one of the first people up that day, let alone clients. And Sandy Hill Pittman, I think, is one of the last, and one of the last back into camp as well. So the differences between the journalists as climbers is like chalk and cheese, right? And of course, it was very important that the leaders of these teams make sure that the journalists get everything that they want, that the journalists are happy, that the journalists are taken care of. And I think this can cause some resentment with the clients, like, wow, how come she's going up ahead of me, or how come he's getting that, or how come you're getting an extra bottle of oxygen, and all that kind of thing. So Fisher soon realized that she was very self-important, and failure to get her to the top would cost him dearly. So Fisher not only loses his journalist in terms of Krakauer, but he realizes if he doesn't get Pittman to the top, and she's not a fantastic climber, she's not one of the strongest climbers, if he doesn't get her to the top, he's actually going to be in trouble, or he might be in trouble. he might be criticized in public or something like that. You might have a situation where Krakauer tells this incredible story about adventure consultants, and he's not even mentioned, and so you can feel the pressure start to build. You can feel the screws start to turn in. So if Pittman was a questionable choice as a client climber, so you've got Pittman, who's, are you the best person to be on this team? And goes back to what Ed Vestiers was saying. Some people shouldn't be on the mountain. And then you kind of got to say, who could he have been talking about? Could he have been talking about Sandy Hill Pittman? And I think it's important to, in your own mind, think about some of those names that could be referred to here. Yvonne Phillips, thank you very much. I appreciate it. By the way, I have gone to a lot of effort to talk to you guys in this setting. Let me just show you. Yes, my laptop, and there's a cord going all the way to the kitchen, to the filter of the pool. So yeah, I have gone to quite a bit of effort for you guys. I hope you appreciate it. Okay, you can see it's starting to, there's some color forming in the sky, right? So Sandy Hill Pittman may have been a questionable choice, but then there's also Dale Cruz, the seed client, and he'd paid 18 months in advance. He was even more so. He was the first to sign on. So you had this guy who was actually a friend of, Scott Fisher's, longtime friend. And so he pays this huge amount. That's the other thing. It's not just the client paying the $60,000, it's the leader receiving it and then feeling, I'm going to have to perform now. I'm going to have to get you to the top, whether or not you're capable, kind of thing. And so he couldn't cope with the altitude. So the seed client, the guy who started it all, couldn't really cope with the altitude, even fairly at low altitudes. And that was something Gamelgard had experienced firsthand on a 1995 expedition to Broad Peak with Fisher. She wondered, so in other words, Gamelgard had experienced Dale Cruz struggling on Broad Peak with Fisher. And so she was thinking, why did you sign him on? Why take this guy along if you sort of know he's not going to be able to handle it? And that's where it sort of comes in. Is it a question of greed? Is it ambition? Is it friendship? Is it a combination of things? Is it things will just work themselves out? Is it human error? Is it the weather? Is it both? What's going on? And when I say the weather in this way, it's kind of taking a bit of license to say, my husband just asked if that was a green screen. That's not a green screen. It's reality. Although I guess there is some green, right? Okay. I suppose green screens really make you wonder what is going on, what is real, what isn't real. So the seed money is the first client's money that gets the expedition rolling, and Scott Fisher possibly wanted to have the money, and being a nice guy, wanted to give his friend of 20 years what he wanted, right? So already it's kind of a sentiment is sort of letting things take over, logic and things like that. Sentiment is taking over common sense, right? From the word go, Cruz began to have difficulties on Everest. So that's the other thing is, so now you're on Everest, you've gotten there, and now you've got guys who are sucking in resources. They need more oxygen. They need more Sherpas to take care of them. They need, their hands held, kind of thing. And the more that is happening, the more other people are not being necessarily taken care of, and you're not getting a global idea of what's happening with the team because you are struggling with this one person who's struggling. On the plus side, the fact that Dale Cruz was to some extent struggling meant, I think, and it was, I think, also part of Scott Fischer's attitude, was to give people a certain amount of independence so that they can, operate on the mountain independently. And so when things went wrong, I think Scott Fischer's team were maybe a little bit better at taking their own initiative. Not a lot, but to some extent they weren't waiting for their leader to do everything. They could be somewhat autonomous. Whereas with Rob Hall's team, you had kind of a different situation. He would be more of a kind of a dominant, controlling personality, and you had to do everything he said. And so if someone wasn't there, if he wasn't there, then they didn't know what to do. And a good example of that, I think, was Beck Weathers, who said, well, Rob told me to stay put, so I stayed put. And so he wasn't used to operating autonomously. Does that make sense? So you have also these two different psychologies on the mountain, and it's which is the better system? It's difficult to say. Is the better system where you are somewhat independent, but you can get into trouble and you have all these different personalities doing their own thing, or where you do exactly as you're told, but then when things go wrong, you don't know what to do. When someone who needs to tell you what to do is not there, then you paralyzed. It's difficult to say. I think the answer to that is which expedition of the two had more summits and less fatalities, and I think that's possibly the answer to probably how one should approach it. So to go on, from the word go, Cruz began to have difficulties on Everest. He became very, very quiet and distanced himself from other clients. So yeah, you have a situation where you've signed on someone that you shouldn't have signed on, and it's kind of like carrying. And then there's the sense of doubt that creeps in, and anxiety, and this is what was happening to him. And he's becoming quiet, and already this team is starting to fragment in a way. Does that make sense? Starting to doubt is creeping in. I don't know if I can do it. I shouldn't be here, right? And at some point I'm going to have to throw in the towel or whatever kind of thing. So from the word go, Cruz began to have difficulties. Pete Schooning from Washington, it was 68. If he could make the summit, he would be the oldest person ever to do so. So he has another milestone where this guy would be the oldest person to climb Everest. And I can tell you, when I climbed Kilimanjaro, there's a guy in our group who would be the oldest person ever to have climbed Kilimanjaro. And I don't think he made it a few steps on the night. I don't think he made like 10, 20 meters. He just was disorientated in the dark, and then he was out of the game. So Q, hi there, good to see you there. Well, I'm actually starting to get cold. It's definitely getting dark and late. I might need to move that way. So he started having difficulties. If he could make the summit, he'd be the oldest person to do so. A Japanese woman on Hall's Adventure Consultants team was attempting to be the oldest woman ever to reach the summit. Okay, so that was something else that was also going on. Actually, I'm not sure if that's accurate. I don't know if it's oldest woman. I think she would be the second one to reach the summit. It could be wrong. Anyway, Pete Schooning's nephew, Clev, was 38 and inexperienced. So you had two family members, one very old or relatively old. I mean, I think older people have climbed Everest since then, but inexperienced, right? The same could be said more or less for Tim Madsen from Colorado, Martin Adams, a retired Wall Street investor, and Charlotte Fox. I don't know if they'd been 800 meters, over 8,000 meters before. So of the 8 clients on Mountain Madness, only Sandy Hill Pittman paid the full asking price of $65,000. So that is, I think, part of the reason why Scott Fischer went with her was, I think there were only 2 clients that paid 60,000 or more, right? Which is relatively few for him. And so I think he was also willing to bend over backwards to have a full quota of clients, right? And then we have problems with O2. That's the next heading. From the beginning, there were problems, but none that seemed anomalous. The porters had doubled their rates since yaks couldn't get to Everest Base Camp. The yaks were up to their necks in snow, so this was the weather playing a part, and had to be dug out, and so equipment was delayed. So the crew, 11 Mountain Madness Sherpas, came under increasing strain early on in the season. Annie Thomas, thank you very much. By late March, Mountain Madness still didn't have any oxygen. So you can see how, even before you've gotten to the mountain, there's this tension about things that you have to have there. Thanks, Annie. That you've got this tension about things that need to be allocated. It's not just time, it's oxygen, it's food, it's Sherpas, and so on. It's kind of like juggling when you're climbing the mountain, right? And the Poisk oxygen supply, I think Poisk is a Russian company, cost 33% more than they ought to have cost because a Scotsman, Henry Todd, introduced Poisk by Beaucreef during an earlier expedition. And that effectively made a deal with the Russians to corner the market and distribute it. When Beaucreef attempted to buy oxygen for Fisher, he was troubled by this additional outlay and so attempted to make another deal, but with Zvezda for a heavier product. So in the same way you had this kind of bickering or this contest or this auction for a journalist, you then had the same thing with oxygen bottles and oxygen companies. And then, they've got to buy so many canisters, and then they went to another supplier, and then there's a problem. These oxygen bottles are different, they're heavier, and what impacts that going to have? Answer, well, we'll find out, right? So when Todd became aware that Beaucreef was trying to get a better deal, he threatened to pull the plug. Mountain Madness gave in. They bought 55 Poisk 3-liter bottles and 54 4-liter cylinders from Zvezda, and this is at $325, I think, per bottle. That's a lot. That's a lot. If someone's on the mountain and they can't handle it and they need a lot of oxygen because they're perhaps an much older person that's struggling, and they're going through oxygen bottles like candy bars, and each one is $325 a bottle, you might come back from the mountain with no money, right, for all your efforts. So those numbers would become meaningful, adding up to a pile of life and survival for some, but struggle, peril, and death for others who would not have enough oxygen on summer days. So let me tell you right now, despite them buying all of these oxygen bottles and believing that there were enough, when they were actually on the mountain, it would be a situation of, guys, where's the oxygen? And there would be bottles, and they just weren't sure, where's my bottle? And so that was one of the things that happened on the mountain, was that some people ran short. They didn't have bottled oxygen when they needed it. And if you just think about it, you're on this mountain, you've got oxygen, but if you're on it for too long, if you stay in one place for too long, you're not going to have oxygen. So you kind of got to get from A to B, because if you don't, your oxygen's going to run out. So you don't really have a choice. And if the weather runs foul and you need oxygen, what you're going to do? But if the weather's run foul, you can't move either. So you see that situation. Peach Skooning, the oldest man on the team, attempting to be the oldest man to ever climb Everest, started drawing on the oxygen supplies almost immediately. He was unable to sleep without breathing oxygen since his arrival at base camp in early April, and this uncommon circumstance continued until May 6th. So just think about that. For a full month and a week, this guy couldn't sleep unless he was on oxygen. And so there goes your oxygen supply. Fisher made some private calls to his publicist, Jane Bromett, and one of the recurring messages was that their money was evaporating with every passing day. So you can already feel for Scott Fisher, you can feel that he's struggling to hold it together. This expedition's not going well in terms of the money. He's put in so much effort and it just seems like the gods are against him, right? So it's not just money, but it's also people. The people are having an impact on not just money resources, but time resources and energy resources, human energy. Yeah, foreshadowing, that's for sure. So there were early setbacks. Neil Beidelman and Sandy Hill Pittman, since arriving at base camp, started suffering from a dry, irritating cough. So very early on, the clients are not feeling well. It's happening kind of immediately. Beidelman's cough was so bad, and bear in mind he's a guide. I'm just going to put this hat on, my head's getting a bit cold. Beidelman's cough was so bad that he struggled to sleep at night, so he's also struggling with sleep. On April the 22nd, just after Mountain Madness's third of 4 acclimatizing sorties, 23-year-old Lobsang Jangbu's uncle, Nagawang Topshe, suddenly developed high-altitude pulmonary edema at Camp 2. And this is the guy that I mentioned who was the first casualty but died in June. So he was actually the youngest guide's uncle, and now his uncle dies or was sick, but this is now also weighing on the Sherpa's mind. How is his uncle? So in the same way that clients are not doing well, other Sherpas are not doing well, causing Sherpas that are there to worry, right? So he developed edema at Camp 2, and he would eventually die from that. At that time, he was walking around like a drunk, coughing blood and confused. Fisher was attentive to those around him, had picked up on it, and he ordered Ngawang down. But for reasons unknown, the Sherpa had continued up, and his condition rapidly worsened. So this actually had implications for Scott Fisher as well. Is if this guy who he had employed died, he would need to pay for that as well in 2 different ways. He'd probably need to pay medical costs, but he'd also need to pay for another Sherpa to come up to replace this guy, right? So medications are still under debate, but rapid descent above 600 to 1,200 meters is seen as the most effective measure to deal with edema. It became the task of the clients, right? Became the task of the clients, Clev Schuning and Tim Madsen, to take care of the Sherpa. So now you've got the role reversed. You've got a Sherpa who's not really listening, who doesn't want to admit that something's wrong, and ultimately it was something that was really, really wrong. He doesn't want to listen, and ultimately gets himself really far up the mountain and has got to be brought all the way down, and the only people really available were some of the clients who were lower down, and so the clients are using up some of their resources for this. But it's also scattering the adventure consultants team all over the mountain, right? So when his condition worsened even more, they improvised a makeshift sled and during the night tried to maneuver him down through the dangerous Khumbu icefall. So just think about that. They're trying to lower this guy down the icefall at night, right? Clients. Beaucreef noticed that the Sherpas in base camp did not respond to their ailing comrade for several hours. So Beaucreef's now also concerned, wow, we're not even on summit day. Can we rely on these guys? This is a emergency, one of their own guys. Can we rely on him? And that was also foreshadowing. That was also something that would play out when it mattered. It gave him an indication that he might not be able to expect from them in an emergency, and we'll see what happens. Scott Fisher weighing the cost and the... Am I back? I might need to put this light on here as it gets darker. Yeah, so many psychological aspects. Okay, so Scott Fisher was hoping there would be a sudden improvement. So I don't think he asked for the helicopter in the beginning. And then by April the 24th, Camp 3 was still not in place and the Sherpas were virtually exhausted. While Ngawang fought for his life, the mood on the mountain darkened. Now, you must think of that as well. When you've got someone, whether it's one person or two or more, that's kind of part of your group, and they are coughing and they're struggling and they're fighting for their life, and you are trying to go up the mountain and have your hero's journey. You're trying to have this incredible experience. Meanwhile, it's not as though someone has just died, which is also bad, but someone is struggling and they in dire straits. That's also going to weigh on you. It's going to weigh on everyone. It's going to weigh on the leader. It's going to weigh on the guides. It's going to weigh on the Sherpas. It's going to weigh on the clients. And so that adds a dimension of this is quite serious. People can die on this mountain, and you've got a constant reminder to it. And so instead of your focus being on certain things, you have this almost like a nagging cough. You have this constant reminder that, well, here's this person. What are we going to do, right? And that then again takes resources into that area, and you're getting distracted from what are we going to do on summit day? What about these other people, kind of thing. The clients are becoming restless and frustrated, so that's another thing that's happening. And some muttered amongst themselves that their guides were not paying attention to details and were often too busy to offer a helping hand. So you're getting a sense of disharmony. You're getting a sense of people that are not kind of getting along. I'm just watching a hawk flying over there. I wonder if you can see it. Oh, it's just gone down as I turned the camera. So there's already this lack of unity, right? And it's a situation like this where you've got a 23-year-old guide and he needs to pull everyone together. He needs to recognize the situation, but it's his own uncle, right? And so you're getting a sense that, is there a leadership problem? Is it the problem with the followers? Is the whole thing just cursed? Is the whole thing, just not working out? And then you have something else going on. Other expeditions noticed that Mountain Madness sent their clients off on sorties. So other expeditions are looking at Mountain Madness going, what is going on with these guys, the Americans? They're allowing them to move through some difficult situations unattended. As I said, you can compare which expedition had more summits and more survivors. The Sherpas began to talk about the disrespect some clients had for the mountain. So you're kind of getting a sense that people aren't happy. Like everyone's not happy. The Sherpas aren't happy with the clients aren't happy with the Sherpas. Everyone's not happy about something, right? And as Stephanie says, he didn't want to let his clients down, right? So Sandy Hill Pittman had found a young male climber to share his tent with, and the Sherpas really didn't like that. They thought that was really disrespecting the holy mountain. And, if Westerners noticed something, maybe it was funny to them. But that kind of thing was something that the Sherpas felt. I think they had a superstitious sense about things like that. If you do something like that, it's going to bring about a disaster. That's their belief. And then look at what happened. Now, you could say it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, or is there more to it than that? White squalls fell on the mountain. This meant sending a helicopter to pick up Nagawang was out of the question now. So you had Scott Fisher vacillating, I don't want to pay for a helicopter. Maybe his condition's gonna improve. And then his condition didn't improve, and then white squalls fall on the mountain. Now he can't send for a helicopter. Nagawang had to be carried in a basket on the backs of Sherpas down to Ferish. So now again, it was Sherpas that had to carry him, not a helicopter. And for over 40 hours, amongst blood and vomit, a medical team that included base camp manager and team doctor Ingrid Hunt tried to keep Nagawang's lungs working. His heart stopped for 10 minutes and they restarted it. So this is quite a gruesome, horrible situation that was going on. His lungs became blocked with fluid and Dr. Hunt sucked it out of the plastic tube. By April 26th, the weather had improved and he was airlifted to a hospital in Kathmandu at a cost of about $10,000. Despite the use of precious oxygen during attempts to revive him, he continued to suffer in hospital, dying in June. So, in hindsight, Nagawang should have been, first of all, he should have gone down when he was told to go down. Secondly, he should have been taken down the rest of the way when there was that opportunity. And so you have this horrible end to his climb and his life, and that's got to be weighing on his nephew. That's got to be weighing on him, and that's where his heart and mind is, this 23-year-old. But he's kind of got to get over it and deal with climbing to the summit, right? And it's also going to be weighing on Scott Fisher, who's now losing more money. Just think about that. In one go, he's lost $10,000. I won't say it's half of the money of a client, but if you take that and the expenses of the oxygen, it's quite a lot of money that can disappear very, very quickly. And then you also have Dr. Hunt, who fought for this person's life and failed, who must now return to camp, and all of that unhappiness is part of the equation, right? And yeah, I'm not sure how much the Sherpas were paid. I'm not quite sure what the amount is. Maybe someone else can answer that. It's a good question. I wouldn't be surprised if it's something like $2,000 or $3,000, but I'm not sure. So now it's April 29th, and a deep line began to cut into Scott Fisher's usually carefree forehead. The Sherpas of Mountain Madness had still not prepared Camp 4 or taken oxygen there. On April 30th at base camp, Beaucreef worried about him, their leader. So Beaucreef was starting to worry about the leader. And what is very sad was they would even start arguing as well. Fisher and Beaucreef would also start to kind of disagree amongst themselves. Beaucreef was a strong proponent of self-reliance in the mountains, and you kind of got that sense from the Mountain Madness team that they were somewhat more independent, self-reliant, doing things kind of on their own. But now, because he needed to hold the hands of weaker clients like Dale Cruz, Scott Fisher's acclimatization routine had been broken time and time again. So because of weaker clients, you kind of had the situation of the acclimatization strategy had been broken. And so some of the basic things were kind of unraveling before they'd even gone up to the summit. Let's now deal with strategy. Beaucreef at that stage was one of the world's most accomplished mountaineers. He was focused and disciplined. He often told his charges, save yourself, because the idea once arriving at base camp was not only to acclimatize, but since Beaucreef spoke only passable English, climbers like Cleve Schooning initially misunderstood what he meant. Did it mean save yourself? Did it mean be careful, don't get yourself into trouble? and don't fall into a crevasse. No, it meant conserve your energy. So when Beaucreef said save yourself, he meant conserve your energy, right? Acclimatizing meant a combination of active rest and gradually climbing to progressively higher altitudes, sometimes well higher than some of the human bodies around him had previously endured. So some of them are going higher than they've ever been before. And when that happens, you can't tell always what's going to happen. Mountain Madness throughout April went on 4 sorties, each going beyond the altitude of the last and then coming back to base camp to rest. For the summit bit itself, time was all important. 1 o'clock had been suggested as a good summit turnaround time, right? So this is quite important to remember. The teams had decided, and this is another silly blunder that really could have been avoided. It just comes down to good communication. 1 o'clock had been set as a good turnaround time, and then they said, okay, 2 o'clock is the absolute deadline. So they said 1 o'clock we should turn around, but if things come to ahead, if there's a bad situation, then 2 o'clock is the absolute deadline. And any longer and climbers would run out of oxygen while still high on the mountain. Beaucreef personally did not like to use oxygen because if the supply suddenly ran out, and it was going to, the brain instantly fogged up and the body struggled to adjust under these conditions of severe hypoxia. Now, it's one thing to say, I don't like to use oxygen. There are very few people who can climb without oxygen. Very few people have climbed Everest without oxygen. So it's not as though you just say, oh, I'm not going to climb with oxygen. In order to be a person that can climb it, you need to be very strong and you need to have a much higher degree of fitness than someone who's climbing with oxygen. Beaucreef believed in preparation and was meticulous with his own regimen. So if you were a climber, a good thing to do was to stick to Beaucreef, to ask for his advice, to do what he was doing, to be active, to go up, go down, and whatever. And Lean Gamelgard was one of those who sort of did that. She tried to take her cue from him. He held the opinion that while one acclimatized, the body couldn't rest at base camp because it was too cold. So he felt like you can't go down to base camp and acclimatize, you need to go even lower. But some climbers didn't like that. They didn't like the idea of, well, if I go low, it means I've got to climb back again, And so that was his opinion. Bear in mind, base camp in Everest is still 5,300 meters. Was really high. It's just a little bit lower than Mount Kilimanjaro, the base camp, so it's pretty high. And so his recommendation was after the 4th sortie at the end of April and just days prior to the final push, the climbers must go down to the forest region to about 3,800 meters. So he was quite a busy guy. He wasn't afraid of doing a lot of work. He was not busy is the wrong word. He was quite an energetic fellow, and you needed that kind of energy to do well in the mountains. Beaucreef suggested this on several occasions, but few were receptive to the idea. It meant going a long way down and then having to make up a lot of territory again, including vertical height. Beaucreef insisted it was a great way to revive the system and generate muscle tone. So that was the other thing. You're not just reviving your body, but you're getting fit and strong. Martin Adams was the only client who went to the effort of walking as far down as Verrieg. That's 4,280 meters, while Beaucreef had gone even lower to the garden lodge of De Boch. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. Is it De Boche? Verriche? I don't know if I'm saying it right. I'll only know if I go there, which I actually plan to do last year when the world went into lockdown. So who knows, maybe next year this time. Any takers? We can go there and find out there how to pronounce some of these names. Adams was the first Mountain Madness client to summit on May 10. So you had Martin Adams, who was, I think, the Wall Street dude, and he basically said, okay, you know what, I'm going to tag along with Beaucreef and do what he does. And guess what? He was the first guy to summit. So it just shows you he was on the right track. Yak steak. There's another quote from Galen Rowell. The reader senses that the prevalence of an outside journalist as a client on the most fatal commercial Everest venture was no coincidence. So when I wrote Neverest, I think some people who had read Into Thin Air, because a lot of people who read Into Thin Air read some of my books on the disaster. I think they were expecting me to sing John Krakauer's praises. And, you know, I think some people said that, well, I'm a jealous journalist, or it's sour grapes or something like that. But, you know, Galen Rowell said, you know, the presence of an outside journalist, and that's a reference to Krakauer, on the most fatal commercial Everest venture was no coincidence. I agree with that. I'm not saying it's Krakauer's fault. You could have had any other outside journalist there, but having a journalist there, I don't think it was a coincidence. I think it had an impact. And I've spoken about that in my books, because I was a journalist on certain, I won't call them expeditions, but guided trips, and I felt the dynamics in that situation as a journalist. So it's definitely a real thing. So while everyone else had remained at base camp, Sandy Hill Pittman had gone down to meet friends, including Martha Stewart. She later reported via satellite phone that she'd eaten yak steak and French fries at her favorite restaurant before walking back to base camp overnight. The next morning, May 6, was the day identified for them to begin the final push for the summit. While her team gathered around for breakfast, Pittman logged on and related the finer points of the previous day to an NBC interactive audience. The archives for the site nbc.com/Everest have since been removed, which I think is interesting. Meanwhile, Beidelman's cough had improved, but Scott had not been feeling too good and was on antibiotics. So Scott has actually gotten sick. Scott has actually, all of this stress over a long period, Scott has actually become ill. And he's not in the last summit push yet. So later on May 6, after the clients had left, Beaucreef had some time to think about what lay in store for them. Shortly after that, almost the entire Mountain Madness camp at base camp was abandoned. Scott Fisher said, "I have to learn to be humble because I don't want to die in the mountains," right? Now, if you think about that quote, and he did die in the mountains, was this a case of him not being humble? I think the fact that he was sick played a role, physically sick, and I think he mentioned that, I think when, we'll get to that at the end, but there was another climber in distress up on the mountain, and he said that he was feeling sick. And so that sickness obviously got worse. And you've got to ask yourself, do you think humility is, if you're ill, should you climb? Has that got anything to do with humility? It might. Was that the bigger factor, or was the journalist a bigger factor in terms of humility? It's, I think, something worth thinking about. But I do think you can think about it without thinking about Scott Fisher. You can think about it in your own life. I have to learn to be humble because I don't want to die wherever it is that you spend your life, right? It's definitely getting quite dark out and cold. May 6, when Beaucreef reached Camp 2 at the end of that day, Fisher had gone back down with Dale Cruz to base camp. So Dale Cruz is still in the picture. As they're going up, Fisher's going down. That evening, Scott was having a beer with Dale Cruz and Pete Schooning. Both had finally given up on their attempt. So they gave up on the very last day, on the day that the summit push really began, right? The next day, Fisher had to climb from base camp to his clients at Camp 2, who were resting so that they could get to Camp 3. On his way, he struggled to pass Scotsman Henry Todd, an older climber with Himalayan guides. When they spoke to one another, Todd said that Scott Fisher struggled to speak, but coughed and coughed. And I think that is a very important first-hand encounter with Scott Fisher you have with someone who's not on any of the expeditions. You have someone who basically encounters him, and Scott Fisher can't even talk and is, way down on the mountain. And it just shows you how far he pushed himself, because he did actually summit at the end of the day. He did summit eventually. Annie says, well, Q says, I hope I get a look at the sky. Well, I can't see the sky in the video, but shall I show you the sky? Can you see? It's not as pink as I expected it to be, but it's certainly quite pretty, isn't it? I really expected tonight to be a pinkish, orange, blazing, spectacle, but maybe it'll be better tomorrow. So finally, Scott confided, I'm worried to Todd. He said, I'm worried about these people. I'm worried about the situation. And so even though Scott was ill, he's worrying about everything. And he was right. He was right to be concerned. But by that evening, Fisher had burned up precious reserves to get back to Camp 2. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Everest Disaster. On May 7th, the IMAX team, encountering high winds and intending to make their bid on the 9th, a day before the other expeditions, with the intention of getting clean shots and not being slowed down, changed their minds and went down. And I think this is so instructional, is the fact that another team goes up, and bear in mind what you just said about staying humble, and they decide this isn't going to happen. We need to abandon our efforts and come back later, right? And if you think about it, with Scott Fisher, there's quite a lot of that going on. Being frustrated. Well, couldn't he just be frustrated one more day in terms of Everest? Just wait one more day. Could they have afforded it in terms of oxygen, right? Could he, anyway, and then, so they decided to go back down, and they encountered Beaucreef and the Mountain Madness group. Everest said he remembers feeling a little embarrassed. So when Everest passed Beaucreef, he felt a little embarrassed that they made the decision that they had. Of course, this was before. And so they wondered whether they were making the right decision, abandoning their summit bid when everyone else was going up. And he said, standing among the other climbers in reasonable weather, he felt quite sheepish going down. This was Ed Versteers. Versteers also said he remembered a lot of smiling faces heading up the mountain. So everyone's kind of in a good mood, and meanwhile, their leader below them is worried and not well. Now we go to May 10th, 1996. In the darkness of the mountain, the machine gunfire that had battered their tents suddenly drifted down. It became eerily quiet. This happened at about 10 p.m. on May 9th. Beaucreef woke up in a tent he was sharing with Schoening, who was behaving strangely. Martin Adams and the Danish woman Leen Gammelgaard. They were at Camp 4 at 7,900 meters. After some tea, the climbers set off, most of them leaving by about midnight. Charlotte Fox, who was celebrating her birthday on May 10th, walked up the white veil that swooped under a sky dripping with stars. All were meant to have 18 hours of oxygen or 3 canisters each, but each person could only carry one at a time. It had been the Sherpa's job to stash a supply of 11 oxygen canisters on the south summit at 8,748 meters. So what you have in this kind of situation is they are relying on the Sherpas to leave life-saving oxygen for them at a higher altitude. And so if there's not oxygen there, then who is to blame for not putting the oxygen there? Is it the Sherpa's fault? Is it the client's fault? Was there enough oxygen to begin with? What's going on? Anyway, so you have a situation where they're carrying one oxygen canister and they're expecting to have, I think, 2 more waiting for them at the south summit. So the Sherpas also had to fix ropes on the dangerous exposed sections above this level. Beaucreef packed oxygen, but was unsure whether he would need any, and in fact didn't use any. So if you think about that, in a way, Beaucreef could have helped, especially if he'd disposed of his oxygen at the south summit. In other words, Beaucreef was carrying oxygen, climbing with oxygen, but not using it. So in a way, he could give his oxygen to other people, and I think that did happen. Lopsang fastened a length of rope to Sandy Hill Pittman and headed up with her. So you literally had a situation where Sandy Hill Pittman was being kind of, sounds like it, like she was being short roped to the summit, basically. And if you think about it, this 23-year-old Sherpa, he's supposed to be managing everybody, guiding everybody, guiding the whole thing almost in the absence of Scott Fisher, who wasn't really around. And instead, he's stuck with Sandy Hill Pittman, right, who was going to be lower down as well. So he's not there leading the expedition. He's kind of there keeping it from falling apart in a way. And so this is a quote from Lopsang in an interview that he did with John Krakauer. He said, "But this year on summer day, I'm tired and sick because the day before I'm carrying 80 pounds, maybe 75 pounds from Camp 3 to Camp 4. I'm carrying Sandy's telephone. I'm also very tired because on summer day, I take up Sandy together on rope above Camp 4. I'm too tired. I vomit. So I tell Ang Dorje, Holstadar, you fix line. He says, okay. I tell to Neil, that's Neil Beidelman, you take ropes from me. So although it was his job, he's kind of stuck looking after Sandy Hill. And so he's kind of delegating to everyone else that they must do certain things. I do want to just highlight that he says, I'm carrying 80 pounds, maybe 75 pounds from Camp 3 to Camp 4. I'm carrying Sandy's telephone. And I think what he's talking about there was that he was carrying her satellite phone, and those are quite heavy. Those in 1996 were quite heavy. Is that a bit better? I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to complete this live, just because of the darkness and because of how much is left. Do you guys think I should carry on tomorrow? What do you guys think? Can you guys see the moon there? Yeah, I see it's been an hour and 25 minutes. Wonder if I can go a little bit further. I think I'm just going to do 2 more paragraphs and I'll carry on with the rest next time. So Lopsang is basically short roping Sandy Hill Pittman, and he's exhausted, he's sick, he's tired, he's vomiting, and he tells Ang Dorje, you're going to need to fix the ropes. And Ang Dorje's not very happy with that. He doesn't want to do everything, right? And according to Lopsang, Ang Dorje says, okay, you fix the line, okay. Chef Betsy, as always, thank you for putting up on thank you for putting into every bit of your work. I've learned more from you than from. Sorry, I didn't see the rest. See if I can. I've learned more from you than many college professors. Oh, that's I'm glad I saw that. So if you guys are very curious, I did put a link to this article in the description, and I also put a link to the NEVEREST series of books in the description if you haven't read it. A lot of the articles and videos and photos are hyperlinked in those narratives, so you can check that out on Kindle. I will probably finish this, I think maybe tomorrow, weather permitting. As far as I know, tomorrow's going to be cloudier than this, so we'll see. Let me just do two more paragraphs. Scott Fisher was very slow to leave Camp 4. So Camp 4 is the final camp. He left just after Gamel Guard. She turned back to check how he was, but after that, hurried to stick with the group in order to not climb alone on summer days. So you literally had Scott Fisher, the leader of adventure consultants, climbing right behind his whole group, and the back mark is staying ahead of him. And what does that show you? It shows you that that he was climbing very slowly, and it just seemed as though he was determined to summit no matter what. And one wonders if you took the whole adventure consultants out of the equation, you just took them completely out, would Scott Fisher still have tried to go for the summit that day? In any event, Beaucreef summited first at 13:07. So the first guy at the top was 7 minutes after that initial deadline that they'd set. And I'll get this, followed by John Krakauer at 13:12. And John Krakauer was on the adventure consultants team. He was the other journalist. And Beidelman and Adams, 13 minutes later. So Adams was the other client that had gone down with Beaucreef to acclimatize, and so he'd had a spectacular climb. He'd climbed really strongly. Cleve Schoening arrived at 13:45, and Beaucreef took his photograph. After Schoening, the flow stopped. 1400 came and went, 2 o'clock came and went, and Beaucreef, who by then had been on the summit for almost an hour and without oxygen, began to feel cold and tired. I'm starting to feel cold, so I'm going to call it a night here. But I'll be back, I guess, tomorrow for the next. It's probably, based on the Word document, it's still about a third of the narrative to go. So I'll tell you guys more about it then. Thanks a lot, Stephanie, for holding the fort. And take care wherever you guys are. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday afternoon, especially if you're in America. If you're watching from Australia, it must be very early in the morning. I hope you get some sleep. Take care, and I'll see you guys next time.